Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Father Philip-Neri Reese to discuss the thought of Matthias Aquarius and specifically discuss his theories on the subject matter of metaphysics, his understanding of the super-transcendental, and his critique of the Scotistic doctrine of the Univocity of being. Father Philip-Neri Reese is a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph and professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas, the Angelicum, in Rome. He is also the principal investigator for the Angelicum Thomistic Institute's new project on philosophy and the Thomistic Tradition. His main areas of research and interest is metaphysics and anything adjacent to it, with a special emphasis on the metaphysical thought of Thomas Aquinas and its subsequent reception and interpretation. His publications, however, range widely, including articles on philosophy and anthropology, ethics, and economics. He's also a member of the American Philosophical Association, the Society for Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy, the Aquinas and the Arabs International Workings Group, the Society for Medieval and Renaissance Thomism, and is currently serving on the executive committee of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. Father Reese, thank you so much for joining with us today. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Hunter.
So yeah, I'm really excited for this talk because, of course, you recently gave a presentation and paper about this very topic at the Angelicum conference on analogy and univocity in the Thomist and Scotist traditions. How was that conference? Because it sounded like there were a lot of really cool and interesting talks.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm biased because I was organizing it, but I
Okay,
thought it
yes.
was a blast, and happily the a number of the scholars who joined us there also said that from their perspective as well, it went really well. So yeah, we hope to do more in the future like that.
You discussed this guy, Friar Matthias Aquarius. Um, if I could just ask, what sparked your own academic interest into this guy's thought and works? Because he's, from what I can gather, a relatively obscure figure in like late scholastic philosophy and theology. What can you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so you're certainly right. He is definitely obscure, right? So even among Thomists who kind of pride themselves on knowing the quote unquote commentatorial tradition, he's even amongst those Thomists, he's not a household name. Um, which I think is actually a shame because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in what little I've read of him, and so I think it merits further study. As to what got me interested in him, I have a passionate sort of interest for the the entirety of the reception of Aquinas and that tradition of commentators on him. When I was first learning Aquinas's thought, the commentatorial tradition was collectively persona non grata, right? The after sort of the historical turn in Thomistic scholarship in the 20th century, to some extent with Jacques Maritain, but especially with Etienne Gilson, you saw in a lot of scholarship a kind of animosity towards the later interpreters of Aquinas, and so their thought was typically presented as just a distortion of Aquinas. And I think those exegetical questions are really important,
Right.
but I think what that kind of an attitude does is it blinds us to the independent interests of these thinkers, right?
Mm.
And so, for me, this is not exclusively true of the Thomistic tradition, but it's I think it's also equally true of the Scotistic tradition of, I had never even I was never taught that there were such things as Albertists, right? But there was a whole tradition of Albertism that was distinct from both Thomism and Scotism, and yet was kind of on the same page with them as a realist tradition that set itself up against the Via Moderna and nominalism. And so, for me, the learning that these traditions existed and learning that they might be interesting to study in their own right was a kind of intellectual sea change for me. And so kind of because that revelation was so important for me personally, I have a kind of soft spot for the forgotten, abandoned, overlooked, obscure figures in these various traditions. And oftentimes they're obscure and they're abandoned and they're because they're duds, right? But every once in a while you'll find someone like, and I think Matthias is like this, someone who's um, uh, just so interesting in his own right. Maybe not always the best exegete of Aquinas, but always a really interesting thinker. And so yeah, so for me that was kind of the excitement and the joy was, I ran across a reference to him in while I was working on some other second scholastic thinkers, and then said, well, I've never heard of that person before, who is it? And then I was off to the races.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think I very much agree with you about how you approach the sort of traditional mainline Thomist commentators that obviously with respect to historical sensitivity and exegesis, we shouldn't read later commentarial developments and controversies back into the thought of Aquinas in the 13th century. But that's ultimately a different concern than whether or not these commentators have things to say in their on their own grounds and with their own right. I mean, we had Dr. Hochschild on the podcast a while ago where we discussed Cajetan's celebrated theory of analogy, and one of the main themes that Dr. Hochschild was arguing for was, listen, we can, you know, talk about how terrible Cajetan is as an exegete of Aquinas's sentence commentary theory of analogy. That's fine, but it's a wholly different question to ask about whether or not he actually has something interesting to say, especially when it comes to you know, post 13th century controversies on analogy and demonstration. So yeah, I very much agree. And
Yeah, that's right. In my own thinking, just sort of doing history of philosophy, I like to distinguish between three different kinds of questions that we not just that we can ask, but that we should ask when we're engaging with a historical thinker like Aquinas. So one is just the exegetical question. Did Aquinas say P? Or did Aquinas think P? Right? Affirm or deny. Um, a different kind of question is what you might call a systematic question, which is it goes something like this. Given the following set of commitments that we know that Aquinas had, should Aquinas have said P?
right.
Right? And it might be the case that the answer to a systematic question and its correlate exegetical question are not the same, right? And so if a thinker says P, but given a whole bunch of more basic fundamental principles, shouldn't have said that, then what you've done is as a historian of philosophy, you've identified a kind of tension or inconsistency in this person's thought, and that's not bad. That's good scholarship, right? A third kind of question is what you might call the speculative question, right? Just is it the case that P, right?
Right.
Is P true? And I also think that that's an important question for us to raise whenever we do history of philosophy, because I take it at least that historians of philosophy, or at least when I say that I am a historian of philosophy, what I mean is something more like this. I am a historical philosopher, right? So I'm first and foremost a philosopher who's seeking the truth, who's interested in learning from and entering into a kind of dialogue, sympathetic dialogue with historical figures in order to arrive at the truth, right?
Right.
And so for me, what it is to be a historian of philosophy is not first and foremost to be, a historian, right, who just happens to be doing kind of history of philosophical ideas, right? But it's first and foremost to be a philosopher, right? And so I think, I think the point that you were saying Josh was making, which I totally agree with, is yeah, look, like, we need to let the truth lead, right? And so if Candidin's De Nominum says something true, right? Then we need to take that seriously.
Mm.
I I might be inclined actually to say something a little bit more radical than what Josh said, which is uh, this that so in I'm inclined to think that in just the same way that when we read a historical thinker like Aquinas in light of his sources, right? So, in light of his Greek sources, in light of his Arabic sources, in light of his Christian source, like Latin sources,
Mm.
um, that that really does reveal something that is significant and important um, in order for us to answer exegetical questions
Mm.
and systematic questions. I think the same thing can be said about reading Aquinas in his contemporary context.
Mm.
So what were folks like Albert Bonaventure, other contemporaries, saying about the same questions that he was asking. And I think also it's it's equally revelatory to read a historical thinker in light of his subsequent reception,
Mm.
right? So I think that there's actually exegetical value in reading the commentatorial tradition and the critical tradition, right? So in reading subsequent Scotists, subsequent nominalists, right, who are leveling criticisms against Aquinas, precisely because how they were reading the text um, can can in fact open our eyes to recognize an interpretation of the text that maybe we didn't initially occur to us, or it may open our eyes to some kind of ambiguity in the text that we were reading just kind of naively, right? And that's critical for doing good exegesis, right? So I really don't think that the right way to get at the quote unquote historical Aquinas is to just sort of like peel back the later reception tradition,
Mm.
right? And kind of get to this pristine thing that was like Aquinas on his own. I think that's, being blind to how a thinker is received is just as bad as being blind to how a thinker was receiving earlier sources or
Mm.
how a thinker was set in his contemporary context.
Right.
So I tend to think I'm kind of extreme on this, but I tend to think that attentiveness attentiveness to the reception history is um, is not just something that's important for us to do for speculative reasons, right? Is what this later commentator said true? But I also think it's important for accurately answering exegetical and systematic questions, right?
Mm.
So, what in fact did Aquinas say? If a huge swath of the reception history, is just in unanimous agreement that Aquinas said P, then if I'm going to say he didn't say P, I bet I have a pretty darn good case,
Right.
there, right? And then likewise, the way that Aquinas is, or any thinker is subsequently received can kind of help make us aware of what the relevant principles are that we should be attending to when we try to answer systematic questions like, should he have said P?
Right. Right. No, that's very good. All right. And if I may ask another question, with respect to Matthias Aquarius, we understand, of course, that he's responding to Scotistic theories of univocity, but do we know specifically which Scotists he has in mind? Because if I've had Dr. Smith on the podcast as well, and
Right.
if Dr. Smith has taught me anything, the branches of different Scotist positions on this issue are very nebulous. Like there's so many different theories about how to understand this one doctrine, whether it's, Petrus Tome, Antonius Andreas, whoever. So do we know who in his mind's eye he's responding to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially I I was very wary of answering this question. Actually, after that conference and after a number of conversations with folks like Garrett, I'm more and more convinced that uh, Matthias was directly reading Antonius Andreas, which would not be surprising at all. Um, and but that he was within those streams of Scotism that you were mentioning. It really does seem like he was reading the more Andrean tradition
Okay.
um, of Scotism. So in particular, there's a particular premise in the kind of the reconstructed argument that I've got from Matthias in his critique that that seems like it's assuming that a Scotist would say one thing, and it turns out it might be the case that an Andrean Scotist might say that, but maybe a Petrine Scotist would not.
Right, of course. All right, so I figured we could maybe start to get into the weeds of the transcendentals and the super transcendentals. Before we discuss the critique itself, I figured we could lay some groundwork of some of
Great.
Aquarius's commitments. And one of these commitments that you discussed at the talk was this idea of the super transcendental. So before we discuss the super transcendental, maybe we could say a word about what the transcendental is in scholasticism.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a tricky question, right? Because the use of the word transcendens and then kind of correlate words, um, it it shifts over time, right? So when you're in Aquinas's time and in Aquinas's own texts, um, it's got a very loose meaning, right? And it's not even kind of keyed to the notion of the categories, which seems to be a common feature of the later, more technical sense. But eventually, you do get this more technical sense. Even there are some slight differences among the traditions, right? So for Scotus, famously, right, there are you can talk about something um, as transcendental if it's convertible with being, right?
Mhm.
Which would basically mean uh, if all the things in all the categories are that, then
Mm,
that is transcendental.
right.
But he'll also use transcendental um, to refer to disjuncts that are like that, right?
Mm.
Necessary and contingent is one that he likes a lot.
Finite and
Um,
infinite.
Finite and infinite, yeah, that's for him you know, the big one, right? And so it's not the case that every being is finite, every being in every category is finite. It's not the case that every being in every category is infinite. But it is the case that every being in every category is either finite or infinite.
Mm,
So as a disjunction, you've got, convertibility. But each member of the disjunct there is it's not just that the disjunction is transcendental, right? Each member of the disjunction is transcendental. Each disjunct is transcendental um, because each disjunct does appear in each of the categories.
mm.
Um,
Okay.
So you can find something, some being is finite in each one of the 10 categories. Um, you know, the the third kind of group of or class of transcendentals that Scotus recognizes are even less, so to speak, transcendental than that, right?
Mm,
Because these are things that don't even show up in all of the categories.
mm.
Um, they're the way in which they're transcendental is because they're um, they're predicable both of something in that falls under one of the categories, and they're also predicable of God, right?
Okay.
So the famous classic example of this is wise, right?
Right, right,
So the predicate is wise can be predicated of some creatures, and can be predicated of God. Wisdom, right, is um, in one of the categories, right? When it's
right.
predicated of a creature, right? It's in the category of quality,
Mm,
um, but it's also predicable of God, right? And given divine simplicity, we're not going to say that God's wisdom is just the same thing as categorical wisdom.
right.
Um, you know,
Okay.
and or at least it's not the same in the sense that it falls under the category, right?
Mm,
So so you've got, even in Scotus, who is being much more technical, right, with his language, there's this multivocity, right, of transcendentality. In later, in neo-scholasticism, you get at least neo-scholasticism outside of the Scotus tradition,
mm.
there tends to be a kind of reduction of transcendental to mean convertibility with being.
Right.
And sometimes in the neo scholastic tradition, like particularly in the Suarezan tradition and in the Thomistic tradition, um, you get an even stronger claim, right? Which is just that to be transcendental is just to be a property of being.
Right. Yeah.
So you
Okay.
get in the 20th century, you get these debates about whether res is really a transcendental,
Right.
and a lot of the argument, or whether aliquid is or unum is really a transcendental, and a lot of the force of the argument when you read those debates is, well, it can't res can't really be a transcendental because res isn't a property of ens, it's just ends.
Right.
It's the subject rather than a property.
Right.
And Yeah, so there's this wide range of usage. With respect to the relationship between transcendental and super transcendental, there is, I think, something um, very simple that we can say, right? So uh, X is transcendental um, if and only if um, it is not limited to one category of extramental being.
Okay.
So that's going to be a really, really safe thing to say. So like if it's not limited in its predication to a single category of extramental being, then it's
Hmm.
transcendental. And then the um, when the language of super-transcendentality comes into the picture, the way that it comes in is in a kind of parallel way, right? So X is super-transcendental if and only if um, X is not only predicable of real being or extramental being,
Mm.
right? So
Okay.
if X is predicable of, real being and of at least some, you know, ens rationis,
Right. Cognition
or
dependent. Right.
reason, or in one of the things that I really like about Matthias is that he actually has a more expansive understanding of super-transcendentality as well. So he's not just thinking about the relationship between being of reason and real being. He's also thinking about the relationship between God and creatures, and the relationship between being per se and being per occidens. And that last one is rarely discussed
Mm.
in these kinds of contexts.
Right. You said that during your talk, I know that you said that he sort of tags on per se and per accidens after he's talked about gods and creatures, substance accident, ens reale, ens rationis, sort of just
Mhm.
drive home the point that this is just being as common to anything that
Yeah,
could possibly be
it's
said.
radically all inclusive. Yeah.
Right. It's what did you have in your graph, the cube of being or the cube
Yeah,
of yeah.
I did try to kind of like visually illustrate it with a cube. Yeah.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, okay. So prior to Aquarius, if I may ask, do any scholastics envisage these transcendentals as having an extension beyond just the order of ens naturae or ens reale? But like, can we think about cognition dependent res or ray? Like, is that something that is discussed, or I
Yeah.
don't.
So
So go ahead.
no, please.
Oh, I just remember that I remember someone mentioning during your talk that the term super transcendental isn't unique to uh, uh, Aquarius. That someone before him coined the term. Someone made this new terminology. So I don't know if someone else was making this claim that the transcendentals don't apply to just cognition independent being, but I could be mistaken.
Yeah, okay, good. So just a couple things to clarify, and then to speak to the actual question. So the first point of clarification is actually just that, so Matthias himself never uses the language of super transcendentality.
Okay, okay, sorry.
You know, and there are many scholastic thinkers who have super transcendentality sort of built into their thought, even though they never call it that, right?
Mm,
The it's interesting. The language of um, the terminology of super transcendentality actually sort of follows structurally the development of the terminology of transcendentality,
okay.
which is it. So transcendentality first makes its appearance in logical texts. So, logicians are thinking about like the Porphyrian tree, right?
Mm,
And they're recognizing that there are some predicates that seem to be predicable, across trees, so to speak, right? You've got the substance tree, you've got the quantity tree, you've got the quality tree, right? And then there are these terms that you sort of visually have to like have them hovering above
mm,
because they, like being, because they apply across the board. So it's the scholastic logicians who first developed the language of transcendentality, and then it later gets picked up. The same thing happens just much later, historically, that it's these very late scholastic um, logical writers um, who are then, thinking, hey, wait a minute, the same thing is true with respect to real being and being of reason, right? So there
mm.
are these terms that seem to have to kind of hover above the tree of real being and the tree of ensia rationis, and so what do we call those? Well, we can't call them transcendental because we've already used that one. Well, these are kind of super transcendental.
Okay.
And then it eventually, it moves from these late scholastic logical texts to a more general kind of Baroque scholastic reception.
Okay.
Um, so to answer your question, I think it depends. So if you mean, are there any earlier thinkers who have precisely Matthias's um, radically wide scope
Sure.
understanding of the subject matter of metaphysics and the relevant sense of being there? If there are, I've never come across one.
Okay.
There are, however, earlier thinkers who have some piece of it, right? So I mean, the entire, not just the entire Scotist tradition, but arguably Albert and arguably more broadly the Avicennian tradition, the Latin Avicennian tradition has um, has the idea that the being as the subject matter of metaphysics includes both God and creatures. So
Right.
the divide between the creator and creature, or finite and infinite. Um, and then one of my favorite early Scotists is kind of the black sheep of the family. He's a little bit of a renegade, but Nicholas
Monet.
Bonetus
Yeah.
has very, very clearly has an understanding of being as common to being of reason and real being.
Okay.
And so yeah, if all we need is just some extension of a predicate, beyond non-equivocal equivocal extension of a predicate beyond real being, then yes, there is precedent for that. Um,
Okay.
Now,
I
the
mean,
question of
oh,
whether
sorry, go
that
ahead.
would constitute the subject matter of metaphysics is another thing.
Sure. I mean, we had an episode a while ago, or a long time, or not a long time, but a while ago, where we discussed Aquinas's understanding of the division of the speculative sciences, and if John Whipple has driven any point home about this theme in Aquinas is that God does not fall under the subject matter of metaphysics, except insofar as it relates to ens commune, so as like a first cause or whatever. So it's really weird that we find interesting, but kind of weird that we find Aquarius arguing that no, actually, like God and creatures do fall under what the metaphysician studies. Yeah, it is very interesting, and we'll get to that in a second. Um, but okay, that is interesting that you find like different pieces of this theme being taken up, that it's not just being as it exists in its natural constitution or independent of cognition or finitude. There are these figures that seem to suggest that the scope of metaphysics is broader than this.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, it's rare to find a scholastic who's going to explicitly thematize that as such.
Okay.
And so that's, I think, is one of the really interesting things about Matthias. He's not alone, but they're a small crowd.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I figured maybe then we could start to delve into Aquarius's understanding of the subject matter of metaphysics, how he divides the different speculative sciences. Uh, how exactly does Aquarius understand the division of the different sciences and the different subject matters? Does he have an eye with respect to uh, criticizing other approaches and schemas? What can you say to that?
Yeah, so one of the things that Aquarius does is he he distinguishes between three three different senses of so he thinks when you're talking about a science, you need to be identifying its primary subject, right?
Mm,
And and he identifies sort of three different senses of the subject and three different senses of the relevant primacy. And so he does, okay, so the first kind of primacy that he talks about is a primacy of like perfection or degree or principality.
mm,
Um, and so there he actually does, it's really helpful for the reader, right? So he illustrates, before going on to metaphysics, he kind of illustrates um, this this triple primacy with using other sciences.
right.
So he says, okay, if you're talking about the primacy of perfection or degree or principality, then the primary subject of logic is demonstration. Why? Well, because demonstration is like the most perfect form of argument.
Okay.
right? So, and then as a kind of parallel, the primary subject in this sense of primacy of perfection in natural philosophy, Matthias thinks, is the first mover, right?
Okay.
So it's the noblest thing that so like what's the noblest thing that the logician is going to talk about? Demonstration. What's the
Okay.
noblest thing that the physicus is going to talk about? The first mover, right?
Right. And then theology,
And
isn't it like God ad intra or something along those lines? It's
yeah, so it's God sub ratione deitatis. Um,
okay.
so you're not thinking, so it's God as God, right? Which is distinct from God as first efficient cause,
Creator,
God
right.
as unmoved mover, right?
Right.
Like, so think about the each one of the nominal definitions of God in like Aquinas's five ways, right? So those nominal definitions that are functioning as middle terms, those are all God as something else,
Right.
right? It's God as known through effect. Um, and so in sacred theology, that's exactly what you're getting beyond, right?
Okay.
So through revelation, you're coming to know God in himself.
As Trinity or whatever. Okay. Okay. All right. So we know that Aquarius has this primacy of perfection that he's bringing to bear about regarding the subject matter of a science, but he also has the primacy of what was it that you discussed? Predication, attribution, and
Attribution. Yeah.
correspondence.
Yeah, that's right. So the primacy of attribution for Matthias, you might think of it kind of like contemporary Aristotle scholars when they talk about Aristotle's notion of analogy, will talk about a kind of focal meaning or a focal reference.
Mm,
You can think about the primacy of attribution this way. So when we're thinking about this kind of primacy, Matthias thinks that if if what we're thinking about is logic, then the primary subject of logic is is not going to be the demonstration, but the syllogism, right?
okay.
And so why? Well, you can think of it like the the demonstration, the very thing that was primary in the sense of perfection, right? Is well, it's what is it the most perfect thing of? Well, it's the most perfect argument or syllogism, right?
Okay.
So even in its very perfection, it has reference to or attribution to um, the argument or the syllogism. And then likewise, logic will study terms, right, and propositions, but how, right? Well, it studies terms as as the terms from which a proposition is composed, but it'll study propositions precisely as premises. And
Okay.
premises of what? Of an argument, right? So really, you can kind of think of like when you're thinking about all the things that the logician talks about, the thing they all have this kind of reference to and orientation towards something, and that something is what Matthias calls the subject that's primary according to the primacy of attribution. Um,
Okay.
so in logic, the subject that's primary according to attribution is the syllogism. In natural philosophy, he thinks it's changeable body, right? So why do you talk about matter and form if you're doing natural philosophy? Well, because matter and form are the intrinsic principles of a changeable body, right?
Right.
Why do you talk about infinite divisibility? Well, because infinite divisibility is a property of a changeable body,
Body.
right? Why
Okay.
do you talk about the unmoved mover? Well, because he's the unmoved mover of changeable
Changeable
bodies,
bodies.
right?
I see. Okay.
So all over and over and over again, you have this focal reference or primacy of attribution. Um, and then he thinks in Sacra Doctrina, the primacy of attribution is not just Christ, but Christ sub ratione salvatoris. So Christ as
Right.
Savior, right?
I do like that a lot because we had Father Dylan Schrader on to discuss the Salmonticenses and their theory about the motive of the incarnation. So that one really does
Nice.
resonate with me. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
excellent. So right. So okay. So we've got the primacy of perfection or degree. We've got the primacy of attribution. The last one for us to talk about then is the so it's the the primacy of adequation, or I prefer of correspondence.
Right.
So adequation is a horrible English word,
Yes.
for, it's barely an English word.
I,
Um,
I think the only reason that we use it is just so we don't sound like, I don't know, post-analytic concerns about, a correspondence, but it's like no,
right.
nobody is confusing the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, no, I've the very fact that nobody has ever heard of Matthias Aquarius guarantees that nobody is attributing to Matthias Aquarius like an early modern correspondence theory of truth
Right.
or something
Right.
like that.
Right. Right.
And quite frankly, even if they did, it actually wouldn't be that bad, right?
Right.
'Cause in general, correspondence theory of truth actually is if you're going to put them in any camp, right? Like the Thomists are going to go under that label, and we can fuss about the
What that
nuances.
means. Right. Right. Right.
Yeah, but so where primacy of perfection has to do with identifying what's like noblest and best, and primacy of attribution has to do with trying to identify like what other things, what's the primary referent,
Reference.
right? The um, the primacy of correspondence has to do with identifying the ratio, or the notion, right? The intelligible character in virtue of which some relevant class is just defined, right? So it's going to be so the thing that has primacy according to correspondence is going to be the thing that shows up in all of the relevant rationes.
Okay.
Um, and so according to, just by way of illustration then, right, according to the primacy um, of correspondence, the primary subject of logic is ens rationis, being of reason. Um,
Okay.
and so you can think about that. So consider, you know, a term, consider a proposition, consider a syllogism, right? Consider, a species or a genus, right? All of those are ensia rationis,
Mm.
right? So when you peer into the ratio of anything that a logician might talk about, um, the ultimate terminus of that conceptual analysis
Right.
of the ratio of that thing is going to terminate at ens, in the sense of ens rationis, right?
Right.
Being of reason, right? So all the things that the logician talks about, when you do a kind of conceptual analysis of them, right, are going to bottom out at being of reason. When you do the kind of conceptual analysis, so to speak, in natural philosophy, the place where you bottom out is changeable being,
Right.
right? So you're not going to bottom out at just being, right? And you're not even going to bottom out at real being, right?
Mm.
Like if you're properly doing natural philosophy, then all the things that you're talking about are going to be conceptually analyzed into changeable being, ens mobile,
Okay. Right.
right?
Right.
And then for Sacra Doctrina, he thinks basically revealed by God, right? Or he doesn't say it in quite this way, but you might think it's like ens revelationis,
Okay. So
a
like
being revelation.
sacred
Um,
scripture, so to is that what?
well, so sacred scripture would be something revealed,
Okay.
right? But so um say you are a sacred theologian who's trying to demonstrate something, right?
Okay.
If you're properly doing Sacra Doctrina, then it's necessary that your middle term for whatever argument you're giving is going to be some datum of revelation.
Okay.
So it might be something determined in a creedal statement. It might be something determined by some magisterial teaching. It might be, something that's just handed on in tradition, right? Like it might be something determined in the scriptures, right? But
Okay.
the workhorse of your argumentation in Sacra Doctrina is going to be something revealed. That's why it's not philosophy or science or,
Right.
anything like that. And so all of those things are going to be, and even the things that are naturally knowable, right? When they're known through Sacra Doctrina are going to be known under the light of revelation. So that's roughly Matthias's idea, right? Is
Okay.
the conceptual analysis of anything studied in insofar as something is studied in physics, the conceptual analysis of that thing will bottom out in ens mobile. Insofar as something is studied in logic, the conceptual analysis of that thing is going to bottom out in, ens rationis. Insofar as something is studied in Sacra Doctrina, the conceptual analysis is going to bottom out in ens revelationis.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. So Aquarius has this threefold division of primacy, and by way of illustration, he's applied it to logic, natural philosophy, and theology. But
Yep.
what about metaphysics? Because
Yeah, good,
we
good,
haven't even
good.
touched metaphysics. Yeah.
Right. So here I'll just let him speak for himself. So here's what Matthias says. The subject of this science, metaphysics, is not just one, but threefold. The first is what is called the principal subject, and that's the subject that's primary by perfection. And this, in metaphysics, is God and the genus of separate substances, which is what is principally aimed at in this science. The second is called the subject of attribution, and this is substance or predicamental being, to which many of the properties considered in this science are attributed. The third is the primary subject according to the primacy of correspondence, and this is being as common to God and creatures, being per se and being per accidens, real being and being of reason. And there's your sort of super transcendental triplet, if you want to think of it like that.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's interesting from a historical perspective. He's doing some really interesting things there. So he's roughly the Averroist subject matter of metaphysics.
Mm.
Is he's making room for it. So he's just saying, yeah, that's the subject matter of metaphysics according to the primacy of perfection.
Okay.
Um, the more standard sort of Avicennian or Aphrodisian, subject matter of metaphysics, as ambiguously substance or the categories, right?
Mm.
Depending on how far you want to push your focal reference,
Mm.
right? Is going to be the subject of attribution,
Okay.
and then kind of the thing that's really characteristic of Matthias and kind of interesting is he's not going to do what a contemporary Thomist would expect, right? A contemporary
Right.
Thomist would expect him to basically identify the subject, the primary subject by a primacy of correspondence with like what Dominic of Flanders, had done just, uh, about a century before,
Right.
and what most contemporary people take to be Aquinas's position, which is that,
Ens
it's
commune.
ens commune, right? Where that doesn't include God, right? And it doesn't include ens per accidens, and it doesn't include ens rationis, right? It's predicamental being, right? He doesn't do that. He says when you're talking about the primacy of correspondence, it's going to be, it's got to be some ratio entis that is prior to either the division, not just the division between God and creatures, right, which is kind of the usual Thomas-Scotus divide.
Mm.
At least today, it's seen as the usual Thomas-Scotus divide. But he says, nope, it's also got to be an ens rationis that's prior to real being and being of reason, and prior to the divide between being per se and being per accidens.
Right. Right. So just to clarify, what falls under the subject matter of metaphysics with respect to correspondence, it's God and creatures, substance and accident, ens rationis and ens naturae reale, however you want to characterize that, and the per se and the per accidens. So all of that falls under correspondence for.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. Wow. Okay. All right. Well, okay. So we've got to. Okay. I still don't quite understand the why he thinks all of this, the super transcendental, is what the metaphysician studies.
Yeah, good. So why don't I this isn't going to speak to all of them, but I think it'll kind of give us a sense of what's going on here. So so here's a distinction that that is a fairly standard distinction, but that Matthias does something sort of unexpected with. So he says being, ens, can be understood in two ways. In one way, as a noun, so a being, right? In this way, its abstract form is not esse, but essentia. So,
Okay.
human is a concrete term. Its abstract form is humanity, right?
Right.
Cat is a concrete term, but catness, right, is the abstract, right? So his thought is this, is when you're thinking about being, ens, which is concrete, and understanding that as a noun, then the abstract form of that is not to be, right?
Mm.
The activity, so to speak, but beingness, right? And in Latin, literally, beingness is essentia, right?
Right.
So okay, so in this way, its abstract form is not to be esse, but beingness, essentia. As such, it mainly signifies essence, not esse. And he says it's divided by the one and the many. Okay, so you've got one sense of being where its abstract form is beingness, essentia, and what it mainly signifies is essence, not, esse.
Mm.
Um, in another way, being is understood as a participle, right? Being, right? Be dash ing, right?
Right.
Um, and in this way, it's divided by the 10 categories. In the present question, right, the question about the subject matter of metaphysics, he says, being is understood in the first way, because it is in this way that it signifies the truth of the proposition, i.e., that about which we can form an affirmative proposition. And here he says, as St. Thomas says in the De Ente, it's
Right.
unclear. I mean, he's definitely thinking about De Ente 1 here, but I take it that most contemporary Thomists would dispute that exegesis,
Right. Rendering.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but so then he says, and so being understood in this way as the subject of metaphysics is said of all things, be they real beings or beings of reason, and is that to which it belongs to be in whatever way it is, right? So the idea here is something like this. Look, what we're looking for is ens commune, right? And it has to be communissimus, right? It has
Right.
to be most common, right? And the idea is, well, look, if we're going to divide being into being per se and being per accidens, if we're going to divide being into, real being and being of reason, if we're going to divide being into, divine being and created being,
Right.
then there's some sense of being that is common, that's being divided, right?
Right.
That's common to these things. And so it's that, right? And he says that's the sense of being that corresponds to the truth of the proposition, not the sense of being that corresponds to like extramental being.
Right. Okay, because he's still talking about on the level of abstraction here, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, he thinks. Um, Here's another way to put it, and this is something that he's explicit about. So um, consider a proposition like the principle of non-contradiction,
Mm.
right? So every being is such that it cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time, etc.
Right.
Um, okay, is that proposition true? Yeah,
Yeah, I'd say so.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. So now, um, what um, what sense of being is functioning as the subject of that proposition? Is it only real being? He thinks
Oh,
no,
oh no, it
right?
wouldn't be.
Is it only being of reason? No, it
No,
wouldn't be. Is it only per se being? No, it
no.
wouldn't be. Is it on right? Is it only created being? No. So it's being in the broadest, widest scope sense, right?
Okay.
And so if you want to say that a proposition like that is true, um, then you're going to have to be able to answer the question, what is it true of? Right?
Right.
And the answer is everything.
Okay. Wow.
Right. So and the sense of everything right there is Matthias thinks is like his sense of being.
Yeah.
This super transcendental sense of being.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so just to recap, so far we've discussed his theory about the subject matter of a given science and his threefold primacy. We've discussed how it pertains to metaphysics and the primacy of correspondence and how this apply how Aquarius is going to just group everything that can be said to be under this division. Okay, so we've got that so far. Now, how does he apply all of this that he's done with respect to critiques of analogy and univocity? How does he bring this to bear about Scotistic concerns?
Yeah, cool. So what I've tried to do is sort of reconstruct in a very particular right. So like he's got a lot there's a lot of criticism of
Okay,
the statistic univocity theory in Aquarius. And so what I'm presenting here is not uh it's it's by no means his only
sure.
criticism, right? But I was especially interested in the way that his kind of super transcendental sense of the subject matter of metaphysics actually seems to be a kind of like a thread that you can trace through his various critiques, and when you do kind of follow that through, um, a to my mind, a really interesting argument emerges.
Okay,
So it's I apologize to you, but the argument is an argument with 14 premises prior to the conclusion. But
okay,
we can it's it takes the form of a disjunctive argument, right?
okay,
So broadly speaking, the form is something like this. Um, Either A or B or C, not A, not B, therefore C,
okay.
right? So, um, so we'll, and I'm happy to just kind of like walk us through the argument.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so start with this premise. Um, the sense of being ends that serves as the subject in propositions like the principle of non-contradiction. We just talked about that one.
Mm,
Or here's another one that Matthias likes a lot. The whole multitude of beings is outside of nothing,
okay,
right? So all beings are not nothing, right? So the first premise is just this. The sense of being that serves as the subject in propositions like that is super transcendental being. Well, why should we think that's true? Well, I just kind of gave you an argument a little bit earlier with respect to the principle of non-contradiction.
Right, right.
You can give similar kinds of arguments with respect to that, all beings are not nothing proposition, right? Are species literally nothing? Like absolute nothing?
No.
No, right? So like ensia rationis are not literally nothing.
Right.
Um, ensia per accidens are not literally nothing, right? And you know, creatures are not literally nothing, right? So the and that proposition, the whole multitude of beings is not nothing, right? Is going to be true of what? Well, of all of them,
Right,
right?
right.
So there's got to be some sense of being that is this super transcendental sense of being that's functioning as the subject of that proposition. Um,
Okay.
okay, so there's your first. So your first premise is just the sense of being that's the subject in propositions like those is super transcendental. Um, premise two, whatever else you might want to say about super transcendental being, it's either going to be equivocal, univocal, or analogical. And so there are your three, your A, B, C, right?
Okay.
So one of those, right? Super transcendental being has got to be either equivocal, univocal, or analogical. And from those two premises, it just follows that the sense of being that serves as the subject in principles like the PNC and the whole multitude of being is outside nothing, right? Is either equivocal, univocal, or analogical. Okay, cool. So now he's going to do the disjunctive argument, right? So first he's going to argue that it's not equivocal, then he's going to argue that it's not univocal, and so then you're going to land at the conclusion that it's analogical.
Knowledgeable.
So here's the argument that it's not equivocal. Well, if the sense of being that serves as the subject in those propositions is equivocal, then propositions like the principle of non-contradiction and the whole multitude of being is outside nothing will be equivocal.
Mm.
But the PNC is not equivocal.
Right,
Right?
right.
The whole multitude of nothing is not an equivocal. That's not equivocal, right? When we say that it is true that no species or no genus it both is and is not in the same respect at the same time,
Right,
etc.
exactly.
Right? We don't, and versus when we say no horse both is and is not in the same respect and at the same time, right? That's not like saying some bats are used to hit baseballs and some bats,
Right,
travel by echolocation, right?
right, right.
That's equivocity, right? And that's not what's happening in applications of the PNC, right? So, um, so then you just modus tollens away, right?
Right, exactly.
So if P, then Q, but not Q, therefore
Yeah.
not
P.
P, right?
Right, right.
So the sense of being that's functioning as the subject in those propositions isn't equivocal. Okay, so now he moves on to the not B part, right? Which is showing that it's not univocal.
Invocal. Right.
So he says, okay, if the sense of being that serves as the subject in those propositions were univocal, um, then that univocal concept of being that serves as their subject would either be a perfect concept or an imperfect concept. Okay. If it's an imperfect concept, so this is clearly his, this is where he's critiquing the Scotists, right?
Okay.
Who says, okay, so you've got to say that sense of being, that univocal sense of being, is either a perfect concept or an imperfect concept. If it's an imperfect concept, then the very things that you Scotists say are the best known principles will be composed of an imperfect concept.
Okay.
But you Scotists insist that the best known principles cannot be composed from imperfect concepts, right? This is part of the Scotist critique um, of the Thomists, who say that no,
Right.
being as first known is this kind of imperfect or confused concept,
Right,
right?
exactly.
And they say no, 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 it can't be, right? And part of the reason why it can't be this imperfect or confused concept, they think, is because it has to be perfectly perspicuous in propositions like the principle of non-contradiction.
Right. Because
Um,
if I understand the debates with respect to post like Henrician concerns about analogy, it's that if there are confused concepts, that's just a very sophisticated form of equivocation, and so you've introduced equivocation and syllogisms, and
right.
your argument is invalid.
Yes. And I mean, a simple way to a kind of simple Scotistic slogan here, right, is um, you know, confused terms lead to confused propositions,
Okay.
right? Imperfect terms lead to imperfect propositions, and the best known propositions can't be imperfect or confused in that way. Um, Okay, so he thinks what that means, modus tollens away, the univocal concept of being that serves as the subject of these propositions has to be a perfect concept. Um, okay, but then he says, if that's the case, so if there's a perfect concept, a perfect super transcendental concept of being, um, then it would follow that in God, there's a composition of a perfect concept, namely this super transcendental concept of being, and some imperfect concept, like a mode, like infinite, right? So, the standard Scotistic thing
Yeah.
is that God is infinite being, right? So they're saying, look, if the super transcendental concept of being is a perfect concept, then I take it, he doesn't say this explicitly, but I take it that um, what he's then going to say is that then a fortiori, right, um, the the more contracted concept of real being is going to be a perfect concept, right? Or at minimum, it's going to be a composition of a perfect concept and a mode, right?
Right.
So eventually you're going to get in the very concept of God, composition between a perfect concept and an imperfect concept, namely the
Right.
concept of a mode. But you Scotists insist, um, in your, when we Thomists level this critique, the standard kind of critique against you, um, that that their infinite mode language is going to introduce a kind of composition in God, right? Um, they insist that there's not. Why? Precisely because they say in God there's no composition of a perfect concept and an imperfect concept.
Right.
Um, and this premise is this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This is the Andrean premise,
Okay.
right? So Antonius Andreas is fairly clear on this point. And so it's, Garrett Smith was saying that there might be strands of the Scotistic tradition that that wouldn't
Right. Might
wouldn't
get
permit
around
it.
with this. Yeah, yeah.
Right. But at least for the Andrean Scotists, right, they're pretty explicitly committed to the idea that in God there's no composition of perfect concept and imperfect concept.
Right.
So that means they would need to modus tollens away from the idea that super transcendental being is a perfect concept. But wait a
Okay.
minute, right? If the concept of being that's functioning as the subject in these propositions is either an imperfect concept or a perfect concept, um, and we've just shown that it's according to the Scotists, it can't be either, right?
Right.
Then you have to modus tollens away from the initial assumption that it's a univocal concept.
Right.
Um,
Right. So
and
there goes
so and so
Univocity.
exactly. And so now, so now we've got, the the clincher, right? So either A or B or C, not A, not B, therefore C, right?
Okay.
So that lands Matthias in exactly the position that he wanted to land. The sense of being that serves as the subject in propositions like the principle of non-contradiction and the whole multitude of beings is outside nothing, right? I.e., the super-transcendental sense of being is an analogical sense of being, right?
Okay.
So you have this really intriguing mix of, on the one hand, something that for contemporary Thomists sounds very foreign, right? Namely, a super-transcendental subject of metaphysics.
Yes, yes.
And on the other hand, something that we're right at home with, right? Which is a defense of the prime, the primitive character of analogy, right?
Yes.
For him, he's he's super happy saying, yeah, look, the principle of non-contradiction or a proposition like the whole multitude of beings is outside nothing is a fundamentally and irrevocably analogical proposition. So it's not equivocal, it's not univocal, and yet it is all inclusive,
Right.
right? It really can be true of everything, right? Where everything is this super transcendental everything,
Mm.
right? But what it means to say that every being is such that it it isn't fee and not fee in the same respect at the same time, right?
Right.
Is going to mean something related but not univocally the same when the being in question is real versus rational, is per accidens versus per se, is created versus creator.
Right. Right. Okay. Wow.
And
Okay.
that's a really, I think, I mean, to me, that's a really interesting argument, right?
Right.
And
Because
so it's, you know,
it doesn't fit in either camp, so to speak. I mean, the card carrying Thomists are going to look at the way he understands the subject matter of metaphysics and think, what are you saying about God and creatures and ens rationis and ens naturae? And the Scotists are going to look, wait, what happened to our Univocity? So he doesn't fit in either category.
that's exactly right. And so, for on my part, I actually think it's really healthy and good for Thomists to grapple with this, right?
Right.
Because I think, too often Thomists will um, appeal to analogy as a way of kind of unifying the subject matter of metaphysics, right? That's a
Right.
standard move. Um, and yet, really, what this argument forces us to do is say, well, wait a minute. If analogy is sufficient to unify a subject matter, um, then, you know, do you think that there's an analogy of being between, you know, being per se and being per accidens? Do you think there's an analogy of being between real being and rational being? Do you think there's an analogy of being between finite being and infinite being? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, then why isn't that all-encompassing analogy sufficient to serve as the subject of a science, right?
Right.
I mean, personally for myself, I think I have an answer to that, to Matthias's sort of question there, right?
Okay.
But it's, I think what grappling with this does is on the Thomist side, it forces us to be much more reflective Thomists,
Mm.
and to really sort of dig down and try to figure out kind of what are the principles that we're working with, such that on the one hand we can appeal to analogy, and yet on the other hand we don't appeal to analogy too much, like I take it
Right.
Matthias does.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so Father Reese, this has been a really, really interesting discussion about this figure, and I just wanted to maybe, with some closing questions and concluding thoughts, I wanted to maybe ask sort of two questions. One with respect to, how does this square up with, the historical 13th century Aquinas's understanding about metaphysics? And then ask the other question, um, regardless of what Aquinas may have thought about the subject matter of metaphysics, what does Aquarius's thoughts, as you said, should it give us any sort of cause for reflection about how we understand metaphysics as philosophic science? So, with respect to, of course, his theories on metaphysics and his understanding of the super-transcendental, is there any precedent at all can you find for this approach in the thought of Thomas Aquinas? Because on one hand, and I feel like if I don't say this fact, the volumes of Whipple on my shelves are going to burst into flames. But Aquinas seems to be very, very clear that the subject matter of metaphysics consists in the study of ens commune. So it's being qua being, and that's taken to include not being as it exists in cognition or being with respect to God. It's just being in general, ens reale. But on the other hand, uh, I'm hoping maybe to get Dr. Kempel on to discuss this issue. There's this really interesting reflection in Aquinas with respect to being as first known ens primum cognitum.
Mhm.
And it's a little complex because, Gilson and Maritain and others have given their own interpretation to that. But it seems to suggest there's equal priority given to cognition dependent being ens rationis as there is with respect to being in its own subjective constitution, ens naturae. So what can you say to all that?
Yeah, great. So the first thing I'll say is that the so there are I won't out anyone on this podcast, but there are, I think, more young Thomist metaphysicians who are becoming open to or even tentatively endorsing the idea that the subject matter of metaphysics for Aquinas um, is more inclusive than as described by folks like Father Whipple or Father Lawrence Dewan.
Mm,
Um, uh, so I think that the more inclusive view is is finding more proponents among young Thomist metaphysicians rather than fewer. Um, and I do think that part of the reason why is just is because um, folks like Aquarius are identifying something that really is there in Aquinas's texts,
mm,
right? So, there really is an analogy between being of reason and real being. There really is an analogy of being between God and creatures. There really is an analogy of being between ens per se and ens per occidens, right? And so if you if you're going to take these analogies seriously, then it's it's very natural to say, well, the analogy of being full stop is going to, in some way, include all of those things, right?
mm,
And not just according to the truth, and not just so not just speculatively, and not just systematically as like that's what Aquinas should say, but that's what Aquinas does say, right?
right.
The yeah, I mean, just look at the beginning of Aquinas's commentary on book 6 of the Metaphysics, right? Look at his his commentary on book Gamma, book 4 of the Metaphysics, and you will see these analogies, right?
Right.
He explicitly endorses them. So it's I grew up on the Whippelian,
Mm,
Dewanian, contemporary consensus view, right? And in fact, I do still endorse that view, right?
mm,
So I think it is the exegetically correct thing to say that for Aquinas, the notion of ens commune that constitutes the subject matter of metaphysics does not include under it ens divinum or ens rationis or ens per accidens. So
Right.
that's, from an exegetical standpoint, I endorse that view, but I understand why some of my peers might feel less confident about that view, the more they read.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so so that's the first thing to say. Then so I guess maybe the second thing to say would just be this. Why? So if I think there actually is some serious plausibility to the inclusive claim, right?
Right.
Why if you're looking at the commentatorial tradition, why do I side with someone like Dominic of Flanders rather than someone like Matthias Aquarius?
Right.
So the the account that I find to be most compelling and most adequate would go like this. Um, if you look at um, Aquinas's commentary on the very beginning of Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, right?
Mm.
So that book four opens with Aristotle has this this powerful affirmation, right? There is a science of being as being and the things that follow upon it, right?
Right.
And but Aquinas's understanding of the proof that Aristotle gives of that, I think, is extremely important, right?
Mm.
And it's that being as being is the thing, um, is the nature of which we are seeking the principles and causes,
Right.
right? And if you take that and if you compare that to some of the things that Aquinas says in his posterior analytics commentary, you'll see that you know for him, so quia demonstrations really do give scientia, but propter quid demonstrations are scientia in the noblest and highest and best
Right.
sense, um, and arguably the um, the thing that unifies the subject matter of a science for Aquinas is going to be keyed not to just like what can you have quia demonstrations about, but rather it's going to be keyed to what can you have propter quid demonstrations of.
Mm.
Um, and propter quid demonstrations are given through the principles and causes that are the per se proximate principles and causes of the subject. Um, so um, when we think about being as common to the categories, being as common to real and rational being as common to per se and per accidens, right? Being
Mm.
as common to God and creatures. Of those various senses of being, right, including the various super-transcendental ones, um, which ratio entis of those is something that has principles and causes? Only being as common to the categories,
Right.
right?
Okay.
So being as common to God and creatures, if you think of it as prior to God and creatures, such that God and creatures, divine being and created being, right, finite being and infinite being, both fall under that ratio of, ens reale,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
That ens reale as prior to, the modes of infinite and finite, that doesn't have principles, right? Scotus is clear about that. And in fact, when Scotus is explicit and clear about that, he's just parroting Avicenna, right? Who is
Mm.
explicit and clear about this, right? So Avicenna says that Avicenna thinks the subject matter of metaphysics is ens in quantum ens, at least the Latin Avicenna, um, but that has no principles and causes. And so about that, there can be no propter quid demonstrations, right?
Right.
So I take it that the kind of principled answer that is exegetically truest to Aquinas and is probably the most compelling speculative answer and kind of systematic answer
Mm.
is this. Look, the subject of a science has to be something about which there can be propter quid demonstrations.
Okay.
Um, there cannot be propter quid demonstrations about super-transcendental being in any of the senses, right? As, super-transcendental being for per se per occidens, super-transcendental being for finite infinite, super-transcendental being for real rational, right?
Okay.
And so you can only have propter quid demonstrations about what folks like Whipple would call ens commune.
Right.
Um, can uh, can you have an analogy of being that extends beyond ens commune? Absolutely, you can, right? But in what sense can there be science about scientia, about
Mm.
that kind of more inclusive being? There can only be quia demonstrations about that sense of being.
Okay.
So proofs about being of reason, proofs about um, divine being, proofs about being per accidens um, are possible, but they're only quia proofs. And what science do they belong to? They belong to the science of metaphysics, which is the science of propter quid demonstrations of categorical being, right?
Okay.
And so, in just the same way that when you know, in the philosophy of nature, right? So in the philosophy of nature, you're doing propter quid scientia of ens mobile, and yet in doing that, you're going to end up um, doing some quia demonstrations of the first mover,
Right.
right? But you're in the philosophy of nature, you're not going to have propter quid knowledge of the first mover,
Right.
right? So what do all of those natural philosophical demonstrations of the first mover, what science do they belong to? They belong to the science of natural philosophy, right? And why? Well, because natural philosophy is unified as being the propter quid science of that subject, right? But that when you do that, you're also going to be able to do quia demonstrations of something that falls outside the subject, right? And so I think that like the kind of true Thomist position says basically the same thing about the relationship between categorical being and anything that transcends categorical being, be it
Okay.
divine being or being of reason or being per occidens, right?
Okay.
And so something like the principle of non-contradiction, yeah, it's analogical, right? It applies, it's true of the wide scope, right? Of all things, in a radically inclusive way.
Mm.
Um, but to what scientia does it belong to study that? Well, to the scientia of ens commune,
Right.
right?
Okay.
you know, and any demonstrations that extend beyond ens commune are just going to be quia demonstrations, but that's like the best we can do
Okay.
because being in that broader sense has no principles,
Right.
right? And so you can't have propter quid demonstrations of being in the more inclusive sense. So I'm inclined to actually grant quite a bit to Matthias and the sort of super. I think we need to take the notion of super transcendentality a lot more seriously than most Thomists do. Um, but I don't think that means that we need to identify the subject matter of the science of metaphysics with super transcendental being.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. All right. Well, Father Reese, this has been a really, really interesting interview. I can't wait to release it. If I can maybe ask just a closing question, do you
Sure.
have any books or resources that you might recommend for those who'd want to learn more about scholastic reflections on analogy? I know we've had a ton of guests on the podcast to discuss this issue, but just as a closing question, do you have any resources?
Yeah, I mean, so the book that I would plug, without hesitation or qualification is Dominic de Torre's book on analogy after Aquinas.
Mm.
It's it's an excellent, he doesn't go as far chronologically as folks like Matthias,
Mm.
or um, any of I mean, like Matthias is the very, very, very end of the kind of the flourishing of Italian, um,
Right.
Renaissance Thomism. And then like basically right after him, actually like during his lifetime, the center of gravity shifts to the Iberian Peninsula. So Dominic is focused mainly on um, Capriolus and then some Italian Thomists who were a little bit earlier than Matthias. But
Right.
it's an excellent book for understanding the reception history of Aquinas's doctrine of analogy. What were the main Scotist criticisms of Aquinas, and then what were the different sort of interpretive strategies that were endorsed or explored by later Thomists. It's very clear. It's extremely helpful. He's both um, exegetically attentive, right? So, he's not just willing, but in fact does raise the question of like which of these commentators that he looks at is kind of on the best ground exegetically,
Mm.
makes a determination about that. But he also thinks that, the systematic and the speculative questions are just as important. And so
Right.
he takes these thinkers really seriously on their own terms, so to speak. And it's just, yeah, I think I really hope that that book becomes a model for future research on analogy.
Right, right. We had Dr. Torre on a while ago, and I really like how he lays out the schema of, okay, there are like these three common thread issues that each of these figures are going to try to address: the ratio rationis problem, the model problem, and then the
Mhm.
equivocation problem. And it just lays it
It's great.
out, yeah, really well. And then of course there's the whole slew of talks that were given at your recent conference. I think they're all out on YouTube, so I'll be sure to link them in the description.
Oh, great.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely a blast.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.